Hi everybody, we are going to start with Unit 3, which is called Cellular Energetics. And it's a fun chapter, and I'm doing the screencast for the first chapter, Chapter 8, which is all about energy and enzymes. Okay, so just in general, cells need energy. Okay, and these are some pictures of some examples of places where cells need some source of energy. So, for example, here, active transport is when things are getting moved across the cell membrane against a concentration gradient. So for example, these little square-shaped ones, there's only 2 on this side, and there's 5 on this side, and if the cell is trying to move them across, it would require energy. So that's active transport. It's using this channel protein, but it requires energy. And then the same is true for the circles. If the circles are trying to go from this lower concentration side to the side where there's more of them, that's against a concentration gradient, and that would require energy. Here's an example of a vesicle moving along a microtubule. That does not happen without some input of energy. An ATP here and here is pretty much not the only, but one of the very main energy molecules that biological systems use, adenosine triphosphate. So we'll learn more about that later, but that's our source of energy. Okay, so the vesicle needs energy to move along the microtubule. Sometimes proteins, as they're getting packaged through the ER and the Golgi and into vesicles, that needs energy, etc. So there's lots of places where the cells need some kind of energy. All right, so we need to understand the rules about using energy. That's chapter 8. And then chapter 9 and 10 is about photosynthesis and cellular respiration. But first we'll talk about some of the basics about using energy in a cellular or biological system. Okay, so 2 main words. Metabolism is the sum of all of the chemical reactions in a living thing. I think that's on this slide. Yeah, so the sum of all the chemical reactions in the body. And there's 2 types. There's catabolic reactions and there's anabolic reactions. All right, and we'll talk about these in a second. And then I'm just sort of outlining the slides here, and then we're going to talk about energy, the different forms of energy, and the first and second law of thermodynamics. All right, so metabolism is just a sort of an umbrella term for all the chemical reactions in some living system. There are many thousands of reactions. This looks like a pathway that I probably had to memorize at some point. There's all sorts of biological pathways in here, metabolic pathways, many, 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 many reactions that all make up our metabolism. Okay, so a metabolic pathway really is just a series of enzyme catalyzed reactions that serve some purpose or have some function. So you start with some molecule, starting molecule A, and there's a reaction that will catalyze that's conversion to molecule B, and then there'll be another enzyme to catalyze it to its conversion to molecule C, etc. So glycolysis is an example of a pathway that will break down glucose. And again, we'll go into detail on that later, but that's just an example of a pathway that requires enzymes that converts glucose into some end products. Okay, so that's what we talk about. That's what we mean when we talk about a metabolic pathway. Catabolic pathways is one kind of metabolic reactions, and that's the kind that breaks things down. So there's a picture here of a cat breaking a vase, and dogs never break anything. So this should be easy to remember that cats are breaking things. I have never owned a cat. I am not a cat person, so I'm going to blame all the bad things that pets do on cats because dogs are perfect. Anyway, okay, so cellular respiration is an example of a catabolic pathway where glycolysis, where glucose is broken down and energy is produced. Okay, so here's another picture. Here's glucose. Add it to 6 oxygens, and you can produce, or we do produce, CO2 and water and energy. Okay, so a catabolic pathway breaks things down. Often, as a result of that, energy is produced. All right, anabolic pathways build things up. So I'm sure you've heard of anabolic steroids that sometimes athletes take to build up muscle. So that's what the word anabolic means, is to build things. Okay, so here is an example of CO2 and water, joining together. This is the process of photosynthesis to build up this larger organic molecule. This is glucose. So there's 6 carbons over here, and we have in one molecule, and we have one CO2s would have one. Anyway, this is photosynthesis, and it requires an input of energy to build this. Okay, so the building up of larger molecules requires energy, so that's anabolic. All right, this is the citric acid cycle, I believe, which is building up some of the other coenzymes required for further. So that's an anabolic pathway. All right, so catabolic breaks things down, anabolic builds them up. All right, here's an example of a piece of mRNA that's building a growing peptide chain. So this would be an anabolic pathway because it's building up a longer peptide. All right, so energy, there's multiple forms of energy. I'm sure you know this from physics, from chemistry. Kinetic energy is the energy of motion. Okay, generally heat energy is thermal energy, moving particles. And then there's potential energy. Okay, the main kind of energy we care about in this class is chemical energy. Okay, this is potential energy available for release in a chemical reaction. All right, this is the focus of this unit. If you took AP Chem or maybe Enriched Chem, you learned a lot about potential energy that's in a bond, for example. And in this class, we're concerned with the chemical energy that is in molecules. So this glucose right here has chemical energy stored in it, okay? And we're going to release that energy through this metabolic pathway. All right, so that's kind of the main idea here, is that the chemical energy is going to be used in our biological systems to make things happen. All right, so let's talk about the first law of thermodynamics. This just is the law that says energy cannot be created or destroyed. It only can change forms. So here's kinetic energy. Here's a girl on a swing, and up here, she's higher up from the ground. So her kinetic energy of motion is getting converted into potential energy. And PE equals mgh. I remember that one. So the further from the ground, she's got more gravitational potential energy. Then she swings back, and that gets converted again. So back and forth, back and forth. Here's a car going up a hill. On the top of the hill, it's got more potential energy because it's further from the ground. Goes down the hill, and that gets converted into kinetic energy. So that's just an example of how types of energy can be converted or changed forms. In biology or in chemistry, the chemical energy stored in the bonds of glucose, or the potential energy, is converted into ATP, or the other kind of energy that we can actually use to do something. So this would be potential energy, and then now it's been released, basically, so that it can do something. It's just a different form of energy. We haven't lost it, we have just changed it. Okay, and then this is that same pathway that's showing the same thing. More or less, just another example. Okay, ATP is our chemical energy that is getting produced or, resulting from a change of another kind of energy. All right, one very important thing to know is that when energy changes forms, there's always a little bit that's lost. Okay, no transfer of energy is ever 100% efficient. Some energy is always lost as heat. So in this picture, this bouncing ball is never getting up quite as high as it was in the bounce before. So here it's high, lower, 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 lower. So every single time that happens, there's a little bit of heat loss or energy loss as heat. So it's not perfect. Okay. The second law of thermodynamics says that every time there's an energy transfer or a change from one form to another, the entropy of the universe increases. All right, and the word entropy just means sort of disorder or chaos. So every time there's an energy transfer and something's lost as heat, that means that the surrounding system of the universe becomes slightly more disordered. All right, so entropy is a measure of randomness or disorder. Sometimes people say chaos. That's a little extreme, but disorder. So here's the example. All right, here's a bedroom. Could be my daughter's bedroom. and it sort of naturally becomes messy without any real effort on her part. So that is sort of a natural tendency of the universe that disorder increases. So if she were to clean it, it would require an input of energy, but it doesn't require energy to let it get to this state. Okay, and here's a car rusting in the desert. Okay, so just with the sun shining and transferring its heat on that car, that's a transfer of energy, and the disorder of this car goes up. All right, it's becoming more broken, less ordered. So that is what entropy is. And the second law says every time there's a transfer of energy, the universe becomes slightly more disordered. Okay, so here's these bouncing balls again. Every time they bounce, they lose a little bit of energy as heat, and this loss of heat contributes to the disorder of the universe. Same goes for this same pathway when looking at glucose. Breaking down to CO2 and water, okay, releases energy as ATP, but it's not perfect, all right? Some of that's going to get lost as heat. And honestly, I don't know what all these people are doing eating lunch. I guess they're all sitting there eating lunch together and it's crowded. This is clearly a pre-COVID picture. And they're all giving off heat. So the universe in this room is becoming more disordered because all these people are sitting there breathing and I guess they're sweating. Okay. All right. Yeah, so the entropy of a system can decrease. So my daughter's room can become more ordered, or less disordered, okay? But when that happens, the entropy of the universe always increases. So, she cleans her room becomes more ordered, but she personally probably got hot or there was an output of some energy into the universe. So it's always offset, okay? Increase of entropy here, and a decrease in the system. All right, we're going to get more into the math of that later on. Okay, here's just another example of transfer of energy. This bear is eating some fish, so it's getting chemical energy out of that fish, and the transfer of the chemical energy into energy that this bear has to run around and lose heat. Okay, so this is the second law. He's sweating, giving off heat, so the universe is increasing in entropy, and here the energy is just being transferred. All right, so that is the end of 8.1. I'm going to keep going and see how far I can get. Okay, let's talk about energy in a biological system. Okay, there's two key ideas here. A spontaneous reaction is a reaction that just happens. It can occur without any outside help or without any input of energy. And a non-spontaneous reaction needs some energy put into it to make it happen, okay? And both types of reactions are super, super important in biology and in living systems. Okay, so here's just some pictures to try to just clarify what's spontaneous and what's not spontaneous. Water flowing downhill. I'm going to pretend you're pausing to think about it, whether it needs an input of energy or not, whether it's spontaneous or non-spontaneous. Building a protein. Phospholipids arranging in a bilayer, active transport, a plant growing, and diffusion across cell membranes. Okay, so you think about it for a second and I will pause. Okay, so I gave you time to think about this. Water flowing downhill happens spontaneously. Building a protein does not. This would require some input of energy to build a protein to add on to that growing peptide chain. Phospholipids arranging in a bilayer does in fact happen spontaneously. If you put oil into water, it just will arrange itself so that, the polar parts are by the polar and so forth. Active transport, here's a big giveaway right here, okay? ATP is going into that system to make that happen. Plants growing, so this is active transport is not spontaneous. A little seedling growing is not spontaneous. It requires an input of energy from the sun. And then diffusion across a membrane is spontaneous because the word diffusion means going down a concentration gradient. Okay, so diffusion would be spontaneous. All right, whoops. Okay, so for predicting whether a biological reaction will happen spontaneously, we have to first ask, can it occur spontaneously, and will it? Because just because it can doesn't mean it will. All right, so we're going to talk about Gibbs free energy here a little bit. We have to do a little bit of math to mathematically predict whether a reaction can occur spontaneously. So let's look at these terms here, okay? This delta G stands for Gibbs free energy. And free energy is basically energy that's available to do work, to make something happen in the cell. Usually those units are kilocal per mole. Don't get too worried about the math here. This is not the AP Chem version of this. S stands for entropy. So delta S is a change in entropy. H is enthalpy, so delta H is a change in enthalpy, and that's basically like the heat or reaction. T is temperature in Kelvin, and then here's our reaction. Okay, delta G equals delta H minus T delta S. Okay, so here's the rule. If delta G has a negative value, then that reaction will happen spontaneously, and that is called an exergonic reaction. It will give off reaction and it will occur spontaneously. So if you did this math and delta G came out to be negative, okay, that reaction happens spontaneously. Okay, and this word exergonic means it will give off energy. Okay, I had to do something, but I'm back, so I might be overlapping a little bit. But here's our reaction for Gibbs free energy. Delta G equals delta H minus T delta S. Okay, and if delta G is negative, that reaction will happen spontaneously. And the word exergonic means the reaction will give off energy and occur spontaneously. So in this little graph, okay, we got free energy on the y-axis here and time on the bottom. So if we start out with reactants that have this amount of free energy and they get converted into products, and as a result, energy is released. That is giving off energy. So this is an exergonic reaction. And you can also see that the reactants had more free energy than the products. So if you did final minus initial, you would get a negative value for delta G. Okay, so the products have less free energy than the reactants. So this would happen spontaneously because we'd have a negative delta G. Okay, the opposite situation is called endergonic. And that is the kind of reaction that requires an input of energy. It's non-spontaneous. So here we have reactants. Free energy is on our y-axis again. Our reactants have a certain amount of free energy. We're putting energy in to convert those into products. All right, so it's requiring an input of energy. So by definition, that's an endergonic reaction. And then our products have gained some of that energy. They've gained free energy, so they now have more energy. And so that is going to be a positive delta G, because if we did final minus initial, we would get a positive number. The products have more. So that reaction is non-spontaneous. So the key thing to remember is if delta G has a positive number, the reaction is non-spontaneous. It required an input of energy, and it's endergonic. Okay, but we also have to consider the other terms in this equation. So delta G is made up of this delta H term, temperature, and delta S. So let's look at those. Okay, delta H is enthalpy. Okay, that's how much heat is absorbed or released by a system during a chemical or physical change. So if we look at this picture right here, we always have to consider the system versus the surrounding. So inside this circle is our system. Everything outside the circle is the surrounding. So in this case, heat energy is being taken in by the system, and so enthalpy is increasing. In this one, the system inside the circle is losing heat. Heat is going out. So enthalpy is decreasing. Okay, this you've probably heard of from chemistry. Exothermic reactions have a negative delta G. Okay, it's tempting to use exergonic and exothermic interchangeably, but I would really encourage you not to do that, because exergonic is talking about delta G and exothermic is only talking about delta H. Okay, H is enthalpy, delta G is free energy, so they're not the same. Okay, in this picture, our reactants start out with this amount of heat energy. you know, they get over the hump and they end up as products with this amount. So they've lost heat. Okay, so if we did final minus initial, we would have a negative number. So this is an exothermic reaction with a negative delta H. Okay, in this case, the reactants got converted into products. Heat was absorbed because the products ended up with more heat energy than the reactants. So heat had to be put in to this one. So this is an endothermic reaction with a positive delta H. Okay, I'm going to skip over this, and then let's talk about delta S, okay, because this is just getting to be a little bit long. Okay, delta S is a measure of how much randomness is happening. Okay, so if this ice cube is melting, you know, what's happening to the entropy of the ice cube as it melts? Well, a solid is more ordered than a liquid. Okay, a solid has a definite shape. It's solid, so it's got less entropy than the liquid. The liquid has more entropy than the solid. It's more disordered. Okay, so the entropy is increasing as this solid ice cube is turning into liquid. Okay, and you got to think about both enthalpy and entropy when you try to decide about delta G, when you're trying to decide if some biological reaction is going to happen spontaneously or not. Okay, let's see here. I guess we can talk about this again one more time. Water flowing downhill, if we think that's happening spontaneously, that would have a negative delta G. Okay, remember, spontaneous reactions have a negative delta G. All right, diffusion is spontaneous. That would have a negative delta G. Growth requires energy. That is non-spontaneous. That would have a positive delta G. This one is non-spontaneous. It's requiring ATP. So that would have a positive delta G. This spontaneous arrangement of phospholipids would have a negative delta G. And the building of a protein that requires energy would have a positive delta G because it's not going to happen spontaneously. All right, awesome.